Okay, in this discussion, we're going to take a look at learning. So before we get to talking about that, we're going to come up with a definition of learning. So what is learning? So just to make it a little easier for you to get through this information, I highlighted the most important information in red. So learning is a relatively enduring change in behavior or knowledge. That's it. And that usually is a result of experience. So that's what you need to know in regard to learning. Now, also, there's we'll take a look at conditioning between environmental events and behavioral responses. And so there are three kinds: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So we will take a look at each of those as we progress. So first of all, classical conditioning was developed and discovered by Ivan Pavlov. And a lot of you may have recognized this gentleman's name. He was the one that came up with the salivating dog experiments. And so we will take a look at those in different videos here. So, but basically, classical conditioning here is a very long, right here, a very long definition. Okay, very complex definition. If you feel you want to pause the video and take a look at this, feel free to. We will define this. You will actually learn to understand classical conditioning through actually looking at experiments that involve this. So the most famous, as I mentioned, the most famous experiment or research about classical conditioning that Pavlov came up with was the salivating dog experiment. So this is what's important. And so I highly recommend you pause the video, stop here and take a look at each one of these. So I will briefly discuss these. I'm not going to discuss this in extreme detail in this video because I actually created a separate video that focuses on this type of learning. So that's classical conditioning. So I definitely will provide the link to that in conjunction with this video. And so that way you'll have a little more opportunity to take a look at this in more detail. So basically it's just this. Here are four terms on the left-hand side: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and then we have conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. Okay, so a lot of you probably do not know what these refer to, and that's fine. You have not experienced these before. But take, for instance, a neutral stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus could be like, take for instance, an unconditioned stimulus could be like dog food for this dog right here. Okay. So I'm just sorry I mentioned neutral stimulus. I meant to focus on unconditioned stimulus. That's what the UCS refers to. That's unconditioned stimulus. That's stimulus that it doesn't have to be. There's nothing trained about it. It occurs naturally. So dog food in and of itself is just a naturally occurring stimulus. Okay. Now, so the dog naturally responds to the smell of that dog food by salivating. And that is, since it's naturally occurring, that is called an unconditioned response. That's what this UCR stands for. Okay, so there are the unconditioned stimulus, which is the dog food. And then we have an unconditioned response, which is the dog salivating. Now, Pavlov, he thought, well, okay, so the dog, that's naturally occurring. But what happens if I introduce a neutral stimulus, which is a ringing bell? That is neutral stimulus. Okay, so ordinarily the dog would look at that, as look at the person ringing the bell and would just, probably tilt its head or raise its ears, but, not really respond to it because it's just a sound. Okay, but Pavlov, he paired the sound of this ringing bell with preparing the dog food. And the dog eventually made an association with that, the sound of that ringing bell with the dog food. And so he associated the two, and then the dog would salivate. So eventually Pavlov discovered that don't even have to introduce the dog food. I can just ring the bell and the dog will salivate because it associated the sound of the ringing bell with the dog food itself. So that neutral stimulus right here eventually became a conditioned stimulus. It was trained. It was a trained stimulus or stimuli. And now that is what the conditioned stimulus refers to right here. That's the CS. That's the ringing bell. Then it has a conditioned reflex, which is the dog salivating. So that is the conditioned response right there. So you can see at the very top here, the ringing bell was actually a neutral stimulus, but eventually became a conditioned stimulus. And then at the same thing at the top here, that was actually no response. There was no salivation at the very top to the sound of the bell. But through conditioning, through classical conditioning, eventually the dog learned to salivate at the sound of the bell. So I hope that helps. And please refer to the accompanying video that I produced. This will even make it help you to learn this and understand this a lot deeper. Okay, so here are just some very important terms. These are, even though they may sound complicated, they're actually very, very simple concepts. So the term right here, stimulus generalization, that's basically is a response that occurrence of a learned response to not only the original stimulus, but to other similar stimuli as well. You can see I highlighted in red the term similar. Okay, so here is this photo right here. This photo right here actually refers to stimulus generalization, because what occurs here, what this refers to is this infant right here, as it's getting its shot, as it's getting the inoculation, it feels pain, and it also starts to associate all of the various other stimuli that occurred during receiving this inoculation. Take, for instance, this nurse that's dressed in white. Well, from this point on, the child, whenever it sees a nurse dressed in white or a doctor, it will think, oh no, I'm about to receive a shot, and hence, will experience maybe some fear, So that is called stimulus generalization. Okay? I hope that's clear. And on the complete opposite of that is stimulus discrimination. So that's the occurrence of a learned response to a specific stimulus, but not to other similar stimuli. So that would, in this respect, this infant might not, have the same response to doctors or nurses dressed in white. It's only would have the same, the response only when it sees the actual needle right here, the shot. Okay, so that was what is known as stimulus discrimination, and that refers to a specific stimulus. So hope that is clear. I know this is, can can get kind of complicated here. So please just take your time and bear with me here. Okay, so earlier we referred to the effect, of classical conditioning as take for instance, we gave the example of the dog eventually becoming having the same response to the sound of a ringing bell as it did to the dog food. And eventually the sound of the ringing bell replaced the dog food. Well, then researchers thought, well, what will the dog salivate if we eventually associate some other type of stimuli with the sound of the ringing bell, and eventually replace the ringing bell with the new stimulus? Take, for instance, the sound of let's just say, an alarm clock ringing. So eventually they discovered that the dog did indeed salivate to the sound of a ringing alarm clock. And so not only was it replaced once, the stimuli, the dog food replaced once, but it was replaced twice. And so researchers, they came to call that higher order conditioning. Okay, and that's all you really need to know from this. Also, researchers have discovered, right here, I put a little note here, that actually when it comes to conditioning, timing can be pretty important. And so conditioning is most effective when the conditioned stimulus is presented immediately before the unconditioned stimulus, usually, a half second to a few seconds. So take, for instance, using the same example that we used earlier of the salivating dog experiment, the sound of the ringing bell, Pavlov discovered eventually that, well, if I ring the bell, usually within a half to a few seconds of giving the dog food, there will be stronger conditioning effects. So that's all that refers to. Now there are two terms I just want to quickly make you aware of here too. So in classical conditioning, there's what's known as extinction. That means just a gradual weakening and apparent disappearance of a conditioned behavior. So that usually occurs when the conditioned stimulus, it's repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. All right, and then there's what's known as spontaneous recovery. Well, actually, recovery just means that the conditioned response right here, it comes back to the individual. All right, we're going to keep that, leave it there, and then move on a little bit. So, this researcher right here, John Watson, he was greatly influenced by the research of Pavlov, and so he eventually felt that, he said, well, I kind of believe that all human behavior is a result of conditioning and learning. Okay, so hence, you notice right here, believed that all human behavior. Okay, so he is known as the basic founder of the approach called behaviorism. That's all you need to know from this slide. I'm going to move on. Now, another researcher that's a little more contemporary than the previous two is John Garcia. You don't have to, it's important that I remind you that you don't have to memorize this individual's name. This is not going to be tested or anything, but all you have to know is that he came up with a term. He said biological preparedness, came up with that term. And so basically biological preparedness, all that refers to is that the individual is innately predisposed to form associations. between stimuli and responses. So innately predisposed, what I put in red here, that means it's naturally occurring. It might occur through nature or through genetics or something. It's more biologically predetermined. So hence the term biological preparedness. And so a good example of this is like take for instance, you might eat something and get pretty sick from it. You get severely ill from it, and you might spend the day feeling sick. Well, more often than not, the individual only needs to experience that one time, hence only needs one pairing, and then will usually avoid that food probably for the rest of one's life. Well, that is called biological preparedness because it only takes one time. So that's not like standard conditioning, that usually takes multiple times over an extended period of time for the conditioning effect to go into effect. So just want to make you aware of that. All right. Now this individual here, Thorndike, he said that basically, that we associate our behavior with the consequences. Okay, so I know that might sound a little bit confusing. So let's just learn by taking it apart and looking at examples. So he felt that our learning of active voluntary behavior are shaped and maintained by their consequences. Okay, so basically, things like trial and error and law of effect, those kind of go along this researcher's train of thought. We'll leave it at that for now. And continuing with our discussion of Thorndike, take for instance, he did this experiment right here. And I mentioned law of effect a little bit earlier. Okay, so law of effect, all that refers to is responses followed by a satisfying effect become strengthened and are more likely to recur in a particular situation. So instead of being worried about all the words and definitions here, we can just look at this and learn from this. So basically the law of effect is this. So he put these cats, Thorndike would put cats in what he called a puzzle box, and then he would put food outside here, this bowl right here, and through trial and error, through the law of effect, the cat would keep trying things until eventually it would press this lever right here, which would open the door and allow access to the food. Okay, so hence the law of effect. So that are trial and error. Both of those go hand in hand in this regard. So this cat right here, in this drawing right here in this image, is the responses followed by a satisfying effect became more strengthened. Hence, the satisfying effect was the door opening and then gaining access to this food. Now, there, also in this type of conditioning, known as operant conditioning, there are responses, followed by a dissatisfying effect are weakened and less likely to recur. So as the cat, in this example, as the cat was trying other ways to get outside by like pushing against this door or nudging against, these pillars or walls or whatever you want to call them, did not work, it was less likely to repeat that. Hence the term, so basically, it was followed by a dissatisfying effect. It was not able to access this food. So I hope that makes sense to you. So far, I just want to remind you, we've talked about classical conditioning, and then now we're talking about operant conditioning, this term operant right up here. So two different types of learning. Just want to remind you of that. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple terms here. We're going to talk about reinforcement, okay, and how that helps to, increase future behavior. So, remember, operant conditioning, in regard to, like, take for instance, the example of the cat in the Thorndike in Thorndike experiment. Operant conditioning, explains that learning is a process in which behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. Okay, I want to give you another example, though, something that you may actually be very familiar with and very motivated by. And that is the, like, take for instance, the majority of you, listening to this right now, want to either pass or get a strong A in this class. And so the type of behavior that you will continue to do throughout this course is shaped and maintained by the consequences of your behavior. So if you do all of the activities and all types of things by their due dates, and you don't miss any, well, then you will eventually, the consequence is you may get a higher grade, or the high grade that you preferred to get, hence, it was shaped and maintained by, that type of behavior, by the behavior, so I just want to, clarify on that. I know this gets a little confusing at times, but just take your time. Feel free to pause the video and think about these. These are really not hard concepts. It's actually a little tougher to kind of, listen to all the wording and examples, So if you just pause and think about it, more often than not, students will get these. Okay, so the second term on here is a reinforcement. And that occurs when a stimulus or an event, it follows an operant and it increases the likelihood of the operant being repeated. So in the example I used before about, I'm a student that wishes to get an A in this course, so I'm going to study for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, and I'm going to actually memorize and study all the material throughout this course. The high grade, like take for instance, as the student starts getting straight A's in this course, those are known as reinforcements. All right, I hope that makes sense. We're going to move on here. So there are two types of reinforcement. There are positive, and that means the addition of a reinforcing stimulus. Okay. So that increases the likelihood that the response will be repeated in similar situations. Okay, so that means, whenever you see the term positive, think of addition. Hence, the addition symbol is positive. Now, what's important to know, though, that there can be negative reinforcement as well. And that's basically, the removal of, or avoidance of, or escape from a punishing stimulus. Okay, so what's important, though, is you'll see that for each of these definitions here, the very end of the sentence, it increases the likelihood that the response will be repeated. And then if you look down here, under the negative, it says the exact same thing, increases the likelihood that the response will be repeated. Okay, so just because it says negative doesn't mean it's worse than positive. Like take, for instance, a good negative reinforcement would be, take, for instance, so response results in the removal of or avoidance of a punishing stimulus. Okay, like take, for instance, you decide that you're just not going to do, you're going to take a break from doing the work in this course, and you're just going to just not do a week. You're just going to take a break, maybe go on vacation for a week. But then all of a sudden the exam comes up later on and you got a D. Well, that right there can be a negative reinforcement. Okay, so that means the removal of or avoidance of. See, so you're avoiding getting a low grade on your exams from this point on. Hence, your behavior will reflect that. I hope that makes sense. Now, just, here's just a little more detail, on negative reinforcement, So I basically said this, so feel free to pause and review this, and we are going to move on. So there are two types of reinforcing stimuli, okay? Okay, there's what's known as the primary reinforcer, and there's the secondary reinforcer. Well, the primary reinforcer, that means basically this, what I put in red, naturally or inherently reinforcing, okay? Such as like food, water, biological necessities. Those are known as primary reinforcers, naturally reinforcing, okay? But then there's what's known as secondary reinforcers, and in red here, I said those are associated with a primary reinforcer. But what's important to know is that that is not a primary reinforcer. It is associated with a primary reinforcer. So I hope you understand the difference there. Moving on. So I just put this chart right up on here just so you could kind of compare the two between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So what you need to do is pause the video and just take a look at these. And these are, what's important is these go across in rows, not columns. So the process, positive reinforcement, then go this way. Okay, and then negative reinforcement, look at this row. Okay, and you can see that both of these have the same effect on our behavior. They increase study time. So please, pause and take a look at these and understand the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Okay, now, on the other hand, there's what's known as punishment. Now, intuitively, I think we all assume, that we know what punishment means. That means the type of behavior when our behavior is followed by an aversive consequence that decreases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Okay, take for instance, this is just an example. Even though it might not be looked upon, in a positive regard, but like take for instance, in child rearing, there are some that feel that punishment should be in the form of, should be physical in nature. Like take, for instance, spanking. Now, that is a controversial type of practice, but I'm just bringing that up as an example, okay? So that is known as punishment. So a child's behavior is usually followed by an aversive consequence. Hence, take for instance the spanking, and that decreases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Now, please remember, I'm going to go back to the example right before this really quickly. Now, reinforcement, you remember that increases a type of behavior, okay? But punishment, that decreases a type of behavior. So that's what's important to know about this. Now, I put in a little note here, that punishment and negative reinforcement are often confused. So just take a minute and think about that. Punishment, that decreases the likelihood of something of behavior being repeated. But in negative reinforcement, that actually increases a behavior being repeated. So I need to understand why those are often confused, but why it's not correct to confuse them. Okay, two types of punishment identified by Skinner, the researcher known as Skinner. Punishment by application, that just refers to basically an operant is followed by presentation of or addition of an aversive stimulus. That is called positive punishment. That's what's known as positive. Positive punishment is also known as punishment by application. Okay, but negative punishment refers to punishment by removal. So what's most important in this, to be honest, is really just understanding positive punishment and negative punishment. And so I put, this chart on here. Please pause this and take a look at this. Look at the rows here, and I think you will, find this be kind of amusing and kind of informative. Okay. In the name of time, though, I'm moving forward. So what are some of the problems with punishment? Researchers have determined that, punishment needs to be applied immediately, but it doesn't teach or promote alternative acceptable behavior. So more often than not, one is just punished, but they're not taught, what is acceptable behavior in this? Why are you being punished? So just think about that, okay? In the name of time here, I am going to move on, okay? But pause this video and definitely review this. Okay, and then here are some of the alternatives to punishment. So please review these and just become familiar with these, become acquainted with these. Here are a few terms here that I'm going to make you aware of, and same thing, pause your video here and look at these a little more in detail. So the things that I really care for you to really know on this slide here, what's most important is is the term shaping. And shaping just refers to basically the individual is being reinforced as it gets closer and closer to its goal that has been set by the researcher, or parent or something of that effect. Okay, so that just means as the individual gets closer and closer to the goal behavior, they are being reinforced. That's all that shaping refers to. Okay, we already looked at the term extinction, and so we're going to take a look at schedules of reinforcement. So don't worry about this so much. We are going to look at this in more detail as we proceed. Once again, I put this just for you to look at, maybe to get some more examples. And we're going to take a look at, some, reinforcement. So one thing that's important to know is this term continuous reinforcement. So continuous reinforcement just refers to the individual being reinforced every single time they exhibit a type of behavior. Okay? Hence the term continuous. Okay, that's all you have to know out of this. On the other hand, a partial reinforcement, well, that is refers to the practice of reinforcing an individual, or just whatever, research participant or something, not every single time that they exhibit the type of goal behavior, but just occasionally. Okay, so instead of every single time, maybe every fifth time or something. That's partial reinforcement. Okay, so we are going to take a look at these a little more in detail in just a second here. Okay? Okay, so there are 4 terms here. Fixed ratio schedule, variable ratio schedule. These are all referred to reinforcement, by the way. Fixed interval schedule and variable interval schedule. Okay, so don't stress about that. We are going to take a look at these starting right now. So right here, what are the 4 types of reinforcement schedules? So fixed ratio, all that refers to is a reinforcer is delivered after a fixed number of responses. Okay, so that's, take for instance, okay, I'm going to give you an example here. So you can look at all of this. I'm going to just focus on one of these. Like take for instance, remember ratio just means for every certain amount of something, a certain amount of something or a certain effect will be applied. So I'm going to keep that simple. Like take for instance, like say commission work, okay? For those who may actually receive commissions in their work. So take for instance, an example might be an individual receives $10 for every 100 newspapers sold. Hence, 10 out of 100, that is called a fixed ratio. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so on the other hand, a variable ratio, okay, that's a reinforcer when as delivered after an average number of responses. So what's important is an average number of responses. So that basically can be gambling. That is an example I put in here. So playing the slot machines at casinos, well, that is a variable ratio. So like take for instance, the gambler might receive $20 as a reward after pulling the lever on this slot machine 50 times. But the next time it might not receive, the individual might not receive win any money until after, like say 75 times. Well, that is a variable ratio schedule. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so we're done with ratios. Now we're going to look at intervals. So first of all, we have what's called a fixed interval schedule. That refers to a reinforcer is delivered for the first response that occurs after a preset time interval has elapsed. So to keep this simple, real simple, here's an example. Paychecks are a fixed interval schedule. So basically, every 2 weeks, one might receive a paycheck. Well, that is a fixed interval. Interval means a basic unit of time. Let's just leave it at that. A unit or an amount of time. Okay, so a fixed, means a set. So every 2 weeks, an individual might receive their paycheck. Okay. Now, on the other hand, there might be what's called the variable interval. Variable, intervals of time. So that refers to when a reinforcer is delivered for the first response that occurs after an average time interval. Okay, so that's not set now. It's an average time. So here's an example of a variable interval schedule. Like take, for instance, a pop quiz, that the instructor might give in a course, in a class. Okay, well, variable interval means that, students might, have to take a quiz, like 2 weeks into the course, but then they might not be seeing another quiz until 7 weeks into the course. Hence the term variable. And that refers to the two types of schedules, or of the interval schedules. Now, I put this as an example here just for you to compare, okay? So please pause the video here, just take a look at this, and just, this is just a little bit of a reminder of what we just discussed here. All right, so we're changing gears here. We're going to talk about some other types of learning, because remember I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that there are many types of learning, many ways that learning occurs, okay? So another thing here is the term called latent learning. So that means that learning that is not immediately evident in an organism's behavior. Okay, so as an example here, this is what we are most commonly, we have a lot of experience with as students, in school, is this, latent learning. So take, for instance, this instructor is sitting here lecturing, looking at the chalkboard or whatever, and but the students, on the other hand, are sitting there quietly and not showing that they are learning. They're just taking it all in, and they're going to show it later on. Like take, for instance, when they take a quiz or an exam. Well, that term latent refers to later on. Okay, so that's another type of learning. And here's an example of latent learning. Another example. I'm not going to go over this, but just feel free to pause this if you want to take a look at this. Okay, so there are cognitive aspects, involved with learning that one has to be aware of, and so psychologists have termed learned helplessness as the result of exposure to inescapable and uncontrollable aversive events, and that produces passive behavior. So take, for instance, whenever, a lot of you are already familiar with this, but you just never thought of it this way. But learned helplessness occurs, for example, when one says, I just can't win on this. There's just no way I can pass this course. I've tried over and over, and I just can't, pass these exams. And, so one starts developing what's called learned helplessness. Okay. So what's the use of even trying? I'm done. Well, that is learned helplessness. So that is, refers to, and I put a note here, that is the cognitive expectation that behavior would have no effect on the environment. Okay, so hence, my behavior will have no effect, no positive effect. So what's the use in even trying? Hence, learned helplessness. Okay. All right, we're going to switch gears here. We're going to talk about another type of learning, and this is called observational learning. So basically, observational learning, all that refers to is the fact that we can learn, and we do learn, by just observing others or observing our environment. And this individual right here, Albert Bandura, he conducted an experiment when thinking about that humans learn through observational learning. Well, he did what's called the Bobo doll experiment or study. Okay, And sorry about getting tongue-tied there. So basically all it was this. The researcher was in a room with a toy here, this inflatable toy, and as the students were in another room looking through a window, the researcher, the adult, was beating the doll, was being violent towards the play toy or the doll, the boba doll. And so here are, different ways that the researcher was acting. And while children were watching, then they let the children in to the room one at a time and just watch their behavior. And they learned through watching types of behavior, violent behavior. So take, for instance, these children are striking, picking up, throwing, hitting with weapons, and even kicking. Just like the researchers, just like the adults did earlier on. So this was the Bobo doll experiment. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied there. Trying to think of too many words at once. Okay. All right. Let me gather my attention here. All right. So here are some factors that tend to increase imitation. Feel free to pause the video and take a look at this. And last but not least, neuroscientifically, what occurs, in observational learning? Well, actually, neuroscientists have discovered that certain parts of the brain actually light up as one is, I'll just leave it at that. They actually light up. So take, for instance, in this example, they have what's called musical mirror neurons. So individuals, as they were actually non-musicians, they were trained to play a piece of music, on a piano. And then as they listened to that same music later on, when they were in the MRI scanning apparatus, actually their parts of their brain actually lit up very extensively. You can see this right here. These are the actual parts of the brain lighting up as they're listening to the actual music that they had actually learned to play on the piano. The brain was very active. On the other hand, the same individual, when they heard other music that they did not learn how to perform on the piano, they that the parts of their brain, the same parts of their brain, didn't quite light up as well. So you can see that right in here, right up here at the top. Okay, but just to remind you, the parts of the brain that did light up, all of these were very active when the individual was listening to music that they learned how to perform on the piano. So that is called mirror neurons. So parts of the brain actually light up like mirrors and actually feel and act like the individual is doing that themselves. And so, that is something that those of you who are interested in the neuroscience of learning would actually be very interested in maybe even studying a little further on your own. So that concludes our discussion about human learning. And I know there was a lot of information on this presentation. Take it one step at a time. Break it up into sections, into topics, and then, learn each topic, very well before moving on to the next. So, as a reminder too, the next step after, viewing that and taking these steps through this video is to get out your study guides, start answering the questions from memory, and then if you cannot answer some questions, refer either to this video or to your textbook. And so thank you for joining in this, and good luck with your studies.